Welcome back. This is Lecture 12, Part 1, and we're going into the introduction of the book of Acts, the book of Acts. Now, the theme we're going to be working with is going to be the following, which is Acts. The book of Acts is to the New Testament, what Joshua, okay, and through 2 Kings is to the Old Testament historical narrative. And that really sets the tone and the pace. In addition to that, the book of Acts forms an indispensable link. That's really key for you to understand. An indispensable link between the accounts of Jesus' life, which gets related to us in the four Gospels, okay, and their interpretation and the application of all of these apostolic truths, okay, the apostolic letters of the New Testament. So that's really key if we understand the book of Acts. There are a number of transitional books in the Bible that are critical and crucial for us to understand, and Acts is one of those books that takes us between the Gospels, okay, and the life of Jesus and those truths, and the application of those apostolic letters, which takes us into the book of Romans forward. So Acts is the key. It is the key book for understanding this. So it forms this indispensable link, and that's the reason why the book of Acts, in fact, Acts tends to be the most misquoted book, misapplied book, misinterpreted book that I find in the New Testament, particularly because it is one of the books that deals with the birth of the church, the historical foundation of the church, and yet the fulfillment of a number of prophecies, but not all those prophecies were fulfilled in the book of Acts, but the beginning of many of those prophecies were fulfilled, but to be continued later on, and as it is revealed to us later in the epistles. And I want to also remind you of the fact that we have a reading that we have to stay on top of, and that's going to be Dr. Ben Ware's book. You should be on pages 137 to page 151, and then in Dr. Carson's book, you should be pages 285 to 296 by this stage of the semester in your reading. Keep up with your reading. It becomes crucial because your exams, your quizzes are in fact coming out of the books as well as the lecture notes. I want you to keep track of that and the statements that I have made throughout these lecture series. As we go into the book of Acts, I also want to encourage you to slow down in some of the reading that you do. And I know that may sound strange from my part because I tend to read somewhere between 2 to 3 to 4 books a month, apart from everything that I do. And I am just ferocious about my reading. But I want to remind you that when you come to certain parts of the books in the Bible, you need to slow down. And that's where I want to encourage you now as we enter into the book of Acts. A number of opening statements with regard to the book of Acts itself, and that is in fact that Acts forms, as I told you, an indispensable link between the accounts of Jesus' life and their interpretation, as well as and the application of these truths in the apostolic letters of the New Testament. This is really what helps to solidify for us, okay, the Gospels into the epistles, and is the book of Acts. Now, the early church itself developed and circulated 2 collections of the New Testament writings. And there were 2 collections, and it's because we see it only as one in the New Testament, but this is how they did it. They circulated the Gospels. That would be Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And notice in the order that I said Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, instead of the traditional, as we say it on the West, in the Western Hemisphere, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's because Mark is believed to be the first of the Gospels that was in fact written. And so when it was circulated as Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and that's called the Gospels. And so that was circulated separately. And then the apostolic letters. The apostolic letters is a second group that was, in fact, in other words, Paul's letters. Paul's letters were circulated as a separate group as well. However, with the early Christological heresies, which did develop in the 2nd century, did not take long. Heresy does not take long to rear its little ugly head up, and it did not take long. The value of the book of Acts, in fact, it was heresies that made the value of the book of Acts much more important to the early church. And it became quite obvious of the value of the book of Acts. Acts reveals the content and the purpose of the apostolic preaching and the amazing results of the gospel. That's what it does. But it's in the midst of this that in the 2nd century, as I said to you now, did not take long to rear its ugly head and begin to insert itself within the teaching of the church. In addition, the historical accuracy of the book of Acts has been accentuated and confirmed by modern archaeological officials. And let me just cite those for you very quickly. And that would be if you were to read, for example, the writings of Stratodoi. Stratodoi was is confirmed for us quite in the book of Acts in chapter 16, verse 20, verse 22, verse 35, verse 36, and 38. Also, if you look at Luke 22:4, Luke 22:52, Acts 4:1, Acts 5:24, all the way to verse 26. The Polytarchs in the book of Acts as well, in chapter 17, verse 6 and 8, as well as in Acts 28:7. If you look at this, and there is a great text that deals with this and is written by A.N. Sherwin White. And Sherwin White wrote Roman Society and the Roman Law and the New Testament. And he takes time to document, the accuracy of the book of Acts, along with the historical data involving all of the Roman government officials that are mentioned in all of these verses that I just finished citing to you. And it is extremely accurate as it is laid out in the book of Acts. Luke records as well the tensions, the early tensions and the struggles within the early church. There was tensions and struggles within the early church. Even the fight between the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, if you remember that in Acts chapter 15 and verse 39, you find that in there. So this reflects, I think, a very fair and balanced research, historical, theological writing. The book of Acts lays out much for us that I don't think that at the very beginning we would have wanted to mention if we were trying to protect the church. Now, the title of the book itself is found slightly different forms in the ancient Greek texts. You do find it, it's laid out differently. That is true. So I wouldn't argue with that. You know, there's about 5,000, something like 5,000 copies of manuscripts, which were all handwritten, hand-copied. They've now been, in the last few years, they've been digitized. Those manuscripts have been digitized and been made available to us. And I have a set of the digitized scrolls of the Greek manuscripts. And so as I go through them, you find a number of different ways that the book of Acts is, in fact, referred to as a title. However, the content itself is quite accurate, and there is very few variations of the actual content in the writing in the book of Acts from manuscript to manuscript. The variations have more to do with the way something has been said and or spelled. For example, if we would take the manuscript, which would be the Sinaiticus is and Tertullian referred to it, or the Didymus, which Eusebius refers to, and in fact the American Standard Version of the Bible and the New International Version of the Bible particularly draw themselves to these particular manuscripts that I just mentioned to you. And then you have the other one is the Vaticanus, and this is it has that one has quite a number of inscriptions later on that were added to it, and it's of which Irenaeus, Tertullian, Cyprian, and Athanasius, the church fathers, have all agreed. And it says literally, it says Acts of the Apostles, Acts of the Apostles. That's how the book of Acts is titled. And then you have another one, it's called Acts of the Holy Apostles, of the Holy Apostles. You'll see that as well in there. And so you have a number of manuscripts, but they're all within the same range in terms of title. You could change, you could create a number of other titles if you wanted to. You could call it the Acts of the Holy Spirit, the Acts of the Holy Spirit in the birth of the church and in the foundation of the church, the Acts of the Holy Spirit in the lives of the apostles, and so forth, because all of this would be quite accurate. It would just be a different prism, if you will. If you were to turn a prism, it would still be the same essence, but you would see different angles of the life of the early church. It is possible that the Greek word, or praxis or praxisias, which is the word acts or ways or behavior, deeds, practices. Those would be all different types of synonyms for the book of Acts, the book of deeds, the book of practices, the books of ways of doing things, the book of behavior, reflect primarily an ancient Mediterranean literary genre, which denotes the lives and the actions of famous and influential people. And that would be, in this case, would be John, Stephen, Peter, Philip, Paul, etc. So the book probably originally had no title like Luke's Gospel, and later on we get these various titles. However, the actual content itself in these manuscripts that have been made available to us now today, and particularly affirmed and confirmed through us through the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls that was found in the Qumran region in 1948. And so you see all these manuscripts, you will see them labeled Q, Qumran 1, Qumran 2, Q2, Q3, Q4, and that's how they've been digitized for us, and so forth. And I want you to understand that really the key here is that the actual content, and let me put it in layman's terms. If you were to take Acts chapter 1, verse 1, and go all the way to the last chapter and verse of the book of Acts, that's the actual content. There is very, very little variation among the 5,000 plus on manuscripts that have been found. Now, there are, and I should mention this, that there are two distinct textual traditions that do exist of the book of Acts, and the shorter one is the Alexandrian manuscript. That would be P45 and P74. Those are the numbers of those particular manuscripts, the sections A, B, and C, and that would be what they call traditionally the Western family of manuscripts. The Western family of manuscripts, those are called that, with P29, P38, P48, and D. These particular manuscripts seem to include a little bit more details. It's uncertain whether they are from the author or were later insertions by scribes based on early church traditions. However, so those are the two basic schools right there that you have in terms of manuscripts. As I mentioned to you, you have the Alexandrian manuscripts, which would be P45, P74, okay? Then you would have the Western, which would be P28, P29, P38, P48, and Section D, because that's how they needed to find a way of categorizing and labeling or numbering these manuscripts, and that's how they did it. But there is some things that were later inserted. What we don't know is how they were inserted, the way they were inserted, but we are certain that scribes were involved because only scribes were the ones who were charged with this. And now most textual or text scholars, or textual scholars, if you will, believe that the Western manuscripts, the first set that I mentioned to you, have later additions because the later scribes tried to, number one, smooth out or try to fix unusual or difficult text in the translation. Or number two, they added additional details as they went along. And number 3, they added specific phrases to accentuate specifically Jesus as the Christ. And or number 4, they are not quoted by any early Christian writers in the first 3 centuries. I think the scholar F.F. Bruce, in his textbook called Acts, Greek Text, in fact, I have a copy of that, and specifically on pages from 69 to 88 or to 80 is where he really addresses this issue. And so if you want a little bit more detailed discussion about that, you could read Bruce Metzger's book, and that would be the Textual Commentary in the Greek New Testament. And that one was published by the United Bible Societies, which is a really good source. And so they deal with that. And I just bring that to your attention because that does exist as a point of academic theological studies, and particularly in the area of textual context scholars. A little bit about the author, since we had spent so much time in the book of Luke itself. If you remember when we were going through the Synoptic Gospels, I want to draw your attention that the book is anonymous, but Luke is strongly implied that it is Luke himself, the Gentile Luke, who authors the book of Luke or the Gospel of Luke, to be the same author here in the book of Acts. Now, there are a number of things that I would like to present to you with regard to that, because I think as I study out all the various sources that are available to us there, and I don't pretend to have seen them all. I attempted to get my hands on all of it, if not most of it, would be that the unique and surprising word we, what we would call the we sections, quote unquote we, W-E, the we sections. You find that in the book of Acts, for example, in chapter 16, verses 10 to 17. This would be the second missionary journey at Philippi. You see that pronoun there, you see we is used a great deal there. Also in the book of Acts chapter 20, verses 5 to 15. In addition, Acts 21, verses 1 through 18, which is the end of the third missionary journey. And then as well in the book of Acts chapter 27, all the way from verse 1, all the way to Acts chapter 28 to verse 16. Paul sent as a prisoner to Rome strongly imply Luke as the author, and because the we sections is written in such a literary style as Luke himself, and we know that Luke did travel extensively with Paul in his journeys. Secondly, the connection between the third gospel, which would be Luke, and Acts is obvious when one compares, and I think we do need to compare Luke chapter 1 verses 1 through 4 as well as Acts chapter 1 verses 1 and 2. So briefly, let's do that. If you remember, we spent a lot of time on this, but I want to remind you of this once again so we can make the appropriate connection. And if we go into the book of Luke, in chapter 1, just to remind you as a point of reference for us, in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and then we're going to tie with Acts chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. And you can see where the strong implication for Luke being the author. He said in Luke chapter 1, verses 1, he says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us," notice among us, or very similar to the we sections of the book of Acts, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus. And remember, I explained to you, when he said consecutive order, he's not talking about a biographical or chronological order. We in the West, we take consecutive order and somehow we define that in our head as being chronological, biographical, but it's not. He's talking about the consecutive order of the unfolding of the events, not necessarily in the chronological order of the unfolding of those events. And so you can see in verse 4, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So this is Luke establishing for us the foundation of how he went about to put together the Gospel of Luke. Then you flip back over to Acts chapter 1 and see the first 2 verses. The first account, I composed, Theophilus, he's talking about the book of Luke, about all that Jesus began to do and teach. Now look at verse 2. Until the day when he was taken up to heaven, and after he had by the Holy Spirit given orders to the apostles whom he had chosen. So now he begins to unfold for us the book of Acts. So here is the most strong possible evidence in this prologue, if you will, of Luke being the same author of the Gospel of Luke as well as for the book of Acts. So then thirdly, the mention of the Gentile physician. There's a mention of a Gentile physician, and the only Gentile physician that we know of that is mentioned. I'm not saying that others did not exist during the New Testament time or even during the time of Jesus or during the life period of Luke himself. But I'm very specific here, and I want to say the one that is mentioned, the connection here. So the mention of a Gentile physician, specifically in the epistles and the letters of Paul, since he was a companion of Paul. We see this specifically made reference to in Colossians in chapter 4. Verses 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, there's a specific mention of this Gentile physician. In Philemon, we see that in verse 24 as well. And 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11 implies Luke, the only Gentile writer in the New Testament. So those link us strongly that it is the same person, Luke. And then there's the unanimous witness of the early church, what I believe cannot be underscored enough. These were the eyewitnesses of their day who give forth testimony. The Mauritanian canon fragment, which we've discussed extensively before, that particular document, which is written somewhere between 180 and 200 from Rome itself, says that it was compiled by Luke the physician. That document, which is a historical document, specifically implies that it was Luke the physician who compiled the book of Acts. And somewhere around between AD 130 and 200, when you take that time period, we have a number of early church fathers. We would have the writings of Clement of Alexandria. We would have the writings of Tertullian. We would have the writings of Origen, in addition to all affirm in their writings as the early church fathers that it is in fact Luke who compiled the historical accounts of the book of Acts itself. So I want you to see that. And then there's quite a number of internal evidence within itself of the style, the vocabulary, the way, if you look at remember I told you about the manuscripts, the digital ones that I have, and when I compare the ones to Luke and the one to Acts, it's extremely similar in its vocabulary and the style, and particularly since both of them use medical terms greatly. Welcome back. This is Lecture 12, Part 2, and let's continue talking about the author himself, since this has, in fact, become a point of controversy with regard to the book of Acts. Now, we have 3 sources of information about Luke. There are 3 sources. I want to mention them to you. First of all, we have the scriptures themselves. And that would be the 3 passages that is found in the New Testament itself. And that is Colossians chapter 4, verses. In fact, let's go there to Colossians chapter 4. And go with me there and look at verses 10. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10 to about 14. Yes, to about 14. Look what it says. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas' cousins Mark, about whom you receive instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And also Jesus, who is called Justus. They're the only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are from the circumcision, and they have proved to be an encouragement to me. So now he mentions here, first of all, in the order, the Jewish disciples, followers that were with him. Then notice the next tier. And then he says in verse 12, Epaphras, who is one of your number, a bondslave of Jesus Christ, sends you this greetings, always laboring earnestly for you in his prayers, that you may stand perfectly and fully assured in all the will of God. Verse 13, for I testify for him that he has a deep concern for you and for those who are in Laodicea and Hierapolis. And then verse 14, Luke, the beloved physician, sends you his greetings, and also Demas. So the Gentile believers who traveled with Paul are the last group that's mentioned here, and Luke is among them. There is, I think, very little doubt that this is the same person that is being mentioned to us. In fact, we also see it in addition to that. If you go to, well, let's see. You could go to 2 Timothy as well. You would see in 2 Timothy chapter, I believe it's 4. In chapter 4. And if you go there just quickly with me in 2 Timothy, and you'll see this also in verse 11, where it says, only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful for me in service. This is the same Luke that is mentioned here. We see it here, mentioned here. So you have quite a number of, I think, the internal evidence within the scripture itself that allows us to draw the conclusion, and very strongly, if you will, that Luke the physician is in fact the author here. And then we have, obviously, the book of Acts itself, which affirms that. Then we have a second source in the 2nd century. As I had mentioned to you, we have the anti-Marcion prologue to Luke, and that was written in there, heavily affirms Luke as being the person. And third, the early church historian of the 4th century, Eusebius. He wrote as in the very well-known ecclesiastical history. He says specifically in section 3, part 4, he says, Luke by race, a native of Antioch, and by profession a physician, having associated mainly with Paul and having companioned with the rest of the apostles less closely, has left us examples of the healing of the souls which he acquired from them in 2 inspired books, the Gospel and the Act of the Apostles. So very early on in the history of the church, which is affirms that it is Luke himself who writes it. There is a somewhat of a composite profile of Luke himself. He is a Gentile. We know that, okay, because as we read earlier, Colossians chapter 4, verses 12, 13, and 14, he's mentioned along with Demas and Epaphras as helpers, and not with the Jewish helpers. And so he's mentioned with as the Gentiles helpers. He's not mentioned in the category with the Jewish helpers. He's from either Antioch, which is of Syria, and the anti-Marcion prologue to Luke mentions that, or he's a Philippi of Macedonia, which Sir William Ramsay, which is a great historian, he says that in March, he mentions that in Acts chapter 16, verse 19. So he falls that he's actually from Macedonia. We know that in Colossians 4:14, he is a physician, or at least he's a very well-educated man. We know that to be true. In fact, Luke writes the best Greek of everybody. It is Luke. He has the standard for the writing in the Koine Greek. Then he also became a convert in middle of adulthood after the church was started in Antioch. We know that he was already a full-grown man, fully educated already when he comes to the faith. That same document that I mentioned earlier, to the Anti-Marcion prologue, mentions that specifically in those writings. We know he was Paul's traveling companion because, as I told you very early on in the last class, in all of the we sections, this is Luke that's writing there. We know that at least it is strongly implied that he was not married. He was unmarried. So he traveled extensively and freely with Paul. He wrote the third gospel, which would be the Gospel of Luke and Acts, because they have a similar introduction and a similar style and vocabulary throughout. You see it, that this has to be the same person. And we know that he died because all the historical accounts, which is recorded, okay, in Boeotia, which is the, it's spelled B-O-E-O-T-I-A, Boeotia, which is the central part of Greece. Okay? We know that he was around the age of 84 when he died there. Now, there are challenges. I think I need to, I would be remiss not to mention it, but I should, and I want to do that. Now, there are challenges to Luke's authorship. There are those who challenge it, okay? And so let me go a little bit through that with you so you understand that. Number one, Paul's preaching on Mars Hill in Athens uses Greek philosophical categories and terms to form common ground. You see that in the book of Acts in chapter 17. But when you get to Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2, Paul seems to regard any common ground, in other words, nature, the immoral witness, and all that, as being simply futile. So the challenge is that you have two distinct styles of writing here, and so there is a possibility to challenge that authorship based on that. Paul's preaching and comments in the book of Acts depicts him as a Jewish Christian who takes Moses seriously, but Paul's letters depreciate the law as problematic, and passing away. And you can tell I'm rolling at the tongue here somehow. I have no clue why. And so that argument is used that, if you recall in the book of Romans, when Romans starts out, Paul really disregards the law, but he disregards it the way the Judaism had interpreted and used it, how the Pharisees and the religionists and the legalists and the moralists. He doesn't oppose Moses' law on the basis of Moses' law. He opposes Moses' law on the basis that how the Pharisees and the Zealots and the scribes and the Sadducees had perverted it. Right? So I think that really, it is an argument, I will tell you that. That is an argument as opposed to when in the book of Acts, Paul embraces it, okay, as the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So they see two distinct approaches here, and that is true. I want you to know that is true. However, the reason for its truthfulness is quite distinct than the one that is presented in these counter arguments as to the authorship of Luke himself. In addition, Paul's preaching in the book of Acts does not have the eschatological focus that his earlier books have, for example, 1st and Thessalonians. Well, of course not, because that argument is presented to us, because if you were to take the first book of Thessalonians, for example, you remember the history of Thessalonica and the early church day. This was a great church. It was a great church. If you were to take 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 1 through 10, you would see the model church. And that really is the model church outside of the Church of Jerusalem in chapter 2. You will see the model church there quite distinct, but you recall they had been deceived. And so Paul's writing really a letter of correction as well as a letter of encouragement there. So even though you have two distinct approaches to this particular topic, but they're for different reasons. So I felt you should know that argument exists out there, and the reason why I would debunk it. And then fourthly, the contrasting terms, the styles and the emphasis is interesting, but it's not conclusive. When the same criteria are applied to the Gospels, the Jesus of the Synoptics speaks very, very differently from the Jesus of the book of John. And I think that's obvious. It's quite obvious. Yet very few scholars would deny that both reflects the life of Jesus. So, again, that argument has been used by textual scholars. And the problem with some of these guys is that they become myopic, if you will. They get so closed in. You know how you see a horse running down the track with the blinders? They get so closed in on something and they don't see the landscape. They just see this one little road here. And but those arguments have been used to advance the challenge to Luke's authorship. In addition, when discussing the authorship of Acts, I think it is crucial that we discuss Luke's sources, but because many scholars, for example, if you were to take C.C. Torrey, believe that Luke used Aramaic source documents or oral traditions for many of the first 15 chapters. That's his strong belief. Well, if this is true, if it's true, Luke is an editor of this material and not an author. And I think that probably is where we missed the mark also. Even if in the later sermons of Paul, Luke only gives us a summary of Paul's words, not verbatim accounts, Luke uses of the sources is as crucial a question as Luke's authorship of the book itself. When we use the term author and we use another term as editor, okay, I think you and I would agree that there is a difference between an author and an editor. Would we agree to that? Okay. But Luke never denies that he's the editor, and so I remember when I was studying, and I remember this. I was at USC, and I was in the School of Religion there, and in our doctoral program. And I remember one of my professors. He just went absolutely crazy on this point. And he was going on, and I can remember we were sitting there, and the classes at the doctoral level, they're not large classes, because by the time you get to this level, the numbers get severely reduced. And so we're sitting in the classroom, and I could see the guys all shaking their head, and they were agreeing with the professor. I'll never forget it. And Professor Gershwin was going, Jacob Gershwin was just going absolutely crazy on this point about that Luke was not the author. And he actually spent 4 class sessions on this. It was 4 full class sessions, and these were 2-hour lectures. And he went on this, and he got into all this minutiae detail. And toward the end of that, I remember toward the end of that 4th lecture on this particular subject, I do recall he looked at me and he said, "Ildefonso, you don't seem to be convinced of the arguments." And I didn't answer him. I didn't think I had to answer him. And because he was making a statement, he wasn't asking me a question. And so I just looked at him, and I could see, the other gentleman turned around, looked at me, and the guy 2 seats next to me, to my right, he says to me, he says, "Well, you're not in agreement with the professor?" Now, he asked me a question, and I said, "No." So the professor heard that, and he said, "Well, why not?" I said, "Well, here's my problem." I said, "May I go to the board?" And so I went up to the board. And I went up to the board, and I wrote, I drew a line. On the left side, I wrote the word editor. On the right side, I wrote the word author. And then I underscored each word, and I asked the class, I said, "Define what is an editor. What does he do?" I said, "Well, he compiles what other people have written, or what's been written about, whatever subject matter has. So he compiles it, right? And he formulates it into a storyline. Am I correct? Is that what an editor does? Yes, okay. Now, what does the author do? The author does the actual writing, correct?" They said, "Yes." So I said, "So we've spent 4 classes. I'm listening to this," and I said, "Maybe I'm just stupid here. Forgive me." And I says, I'm not trying to challenge, Professor Gershwin. I'm not trying to challenge your authority here, but I'm not. I says, I'm not getting it. I said, I know I'm a simple guy, and I'm just not getting it. I says, Luke never claims to be the author. Clearly, we read in the book of Luke, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, that he compiled. Am I right? Remember that? Just let me show you this. Go back to Luke chapter 1. I know this is a minutiae point. You're going, well, Brother Eddie, why are you going through all this? Because this is one of the arguments. Look what he says in Luke chapter 1. Verse 1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order. Okay, this is what the editor does. Am I right or am I wrong? What? Well, go to Acts chapter 1. In Acts chapter 1, verse 1, he says, the first account I composed. He said, I composed. Now, this technical term is being used in the way an editor uses it. I composed Theophilus about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up to heaven, after he had by the Holy Spirit given orders to the apostles whom he had chosen. So now, Luke never claims to be the author, but clearly he says he composed, he put what was already written, put it together. So I'm not understanding the argument against or the challenge to Luke's authorship, because I think it's a false dichotomy. Well, dead silence hit that room. And I remember Professor Gershwin had asked me if I was strongly considered dropping out of the class. And that told me it wouldn't bother me whatsoever, except that I needed the class to finish up. And so if he felt that strong about it, he can ask the dean, which he did. And I went to the dean's office and sat down with him, and I explained to him why, what had actually taken place there. And the dean went to speak to him, and I was allowed back in the class to finish up. And he challenged all my writings thereafter, of course, and I understood why, but I was able, in fact, he forced me to do more and more research is what he actually forced me to do. So it turned out fine at the end. I don't have a complaint about that. But the argument, this argument that he's not the author, or to challenge him on that basis, is one that I could not understand, and perhaps it's just my weird way of thinking, but that I wanted to present that to you because it is a challenge that continues to present itself. Now let's talk a little bit about the dating of the book. There is a lot of discussion, there is a lot of disagreement as to the time of the writing of what we would call the book of Acts. But the events themselves basically cover a very specific period. And I think that's what you need to focus on. Again, the content, not the title or the formulation of it, but the content. The actual content covers from AD 30 to AD 63. That's really the time period, okay, that the book of Acts covers. See, Paul was released from prison in Rome in the middle 60s, and he was rearrested and executed under the Emperor Nero, probably in the persecution around AD 65. Okay? So if one assumed the apologetic nature of the book concerning the Roman government, then the date somewhere between AD 64, which is the beginning of Nero's persecution of the Christians in Rome, and or possibly number 2 to the Jewish revolt of AD 66 to 73. And so if that is true, so if one tries to relate the book of Acts, okay, to Luke's gospel in sequence, then the date for the gospel influences the date of the writing of Acts. since the fall of Jerusalem to Titus in AD 70, that was prophesied, if you remember. In fact, in Luke 21, he relates what is said about that in Luke 21, but it's not described. Seems it's prophesied, but there is no description of it. It seems to demand a date somewhere between AD 70. So then if the book of Acts itself, okay, is written as a sequel, it has to be dated in the 80s. Now, sounds a little convoluting, so let me help you with this. The actual writing of it has to be somewhere in the 80s. The content, so AD 80, somewhere in there, if you wanted to argue, 70 to 80s, okay, as the actual writing somewhere in there, okay? Well, let's take that for the moment. I wouldn't have a problem with that. The issue is, what does the content cover? In other words, I can write to you a letter in 2014 about the details of my life as a boy in the 1950s, okay? And into the 60s. I can write you a detailed letter about that, okay? Now, I write it in 2014, but the period covered is the 1950s and 60s. Follow me? The book of Acts, if you want to argue the date somewhere between the 70s and the 80s, but the actual content that the book of Acts covers is AD 30 to AD 63. Why? Because the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 by Titus, the execution of Paul, okay, somewhere around 64, none of that is mentioned in there or described. And the prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem is mentioned, but it is not described. So again, you need to make a distinction on these arguments as to when it was written and the actual content that is actually covered within the text itself. Don't get those two things confused. And this is what part of the argument that is being presented to us is because they're arguing content as for date and date for content. And once you do that, you get everything turned upside down.